It's a contradiction. They're not saying the same thing. One of them is telling the truth, one of them is not. We have to get to the bottom of that. It's important.
That's the family's own lawyer saying it. Ben Crump, standing in front of cameras, representing Nolan Wells' parents. He said somebody in this story is lying. The girl says Nolan told her he was walking back to the boat. His friends say he told them he was staying behind with her. Two versions of the same 5-minute conversation, and they don't match. The one person who could settle it is dead. Welcome to True Crime Site. This is the story of Nolan Wells, in full, from the beginning. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18, a wide receiver with his whole sophomore season ahead of him. The night before he disappeared, he spent that night at a friend's house, getting ready for the holiday. Nothing unusual. Just a group of teenagers looking forward to the 4th. The next morning, he got on a boat with them, headed for Horn Island, a strip of coastline you can only reach by water. No roads in, no roads out. Whatever happens out there stays out there until somebody brings it back. He had a Division I tryout waiting for him that Monday, a real shot at something bigger than junior college, and everyone who actually knew him says the same thing about how he carried himself. He didn't talk his way into a room. People just followed him, on the field, on the court, in a group of friends. His father has a word for it, a silent leader. That's the version of Nolan his family keeps holding up against the story they were told. And it's why the word lying came out of his family's own lawyer's mouth. In public, on camera. So what actually happened out there? On an island you can only leave by boat. Between 3 o'clock that afternoon and the moment they found him? That's where we're headed. Starting with what should have been an ordinary day. The boat left the dock at 9:56 that morning. GPS data pulled later from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources confirms it. An exact timestamp, no guesswork involved. 7 people on board, according to later reporting. Nolan was one of them. They reached Horn Island at 11:14, just over an hour on the water. Nothing unusual about the crossing itself. For a while, it really was what it looked like. A group of friends spending the 4th on a stretch of coastline most people never get to see. Just open water, white sand, and a holiday that hadn't gone wrong yet. Nolan wasn't alone in any of it. Witnesses describe him surrounded by people that day, folding easily into whatever group he landed near, the way he always did. Nobody disputes that part. Somewhere in there, he ended up talking to a young woman. Later, people would just call her Katie. At the time, she wasn't anyone in particular, one more person on a crowded island during a holiday weekend. Nobody thought to note when the conversation started or how long it lasted, because there was no reason yet to think it would matter. It would matter. That conversation is the one Ben Crump stood at a podium and called a lie. We'll get to exactly what was said in a moment. Around 3 p.m., that's the last confirmed sighting of Nolan Wells. Multiple accounts place him on the island at that hour. After that point, the record starts to thin out fast. By 4:30, according to a local judge whose own son was on that boat, the group was getting ready to head back. Something had gone wrong with the boat itself. A bilge pump failing, taking on water faster than anyone wanted. Dispatch audio later obtained by NBC News catches part of that call for help. A voice on the radio, reporting the boat sinking, asking someone to come. The boat left Horn Island at 4:31. It turned back toward the mainland. Nolan did not leave with it. That's the one point where every account lines up. What happened in the 90 minutes before that boat pulled away? What was actually said, who said it, whether anyone tried to stop him, is exactly where every account starts pulling in a different direction. Evening came, and Christine Wansley wasn't worried. Not yet. Nolan had stayed out late before. A movie with friends, a party that ran long. This felt like that. Then her phone rang. 11:07 p.m. It was Warren, one of the boys on the boat, calling her directly. She said since that the moment she saw his name on the screen, her stomach dropped. His friends don't call her. Not directly, not like that. Whatever this was, it wasn't ordinary. Warren told her Nolan hadn't come back with them. From there, the night split into two tracks at once. Christine called a family friend, Toshima, whose sons had grown up alongside Nolan since they were kids in the same city league. She asked her to check with the boys herself, get a straight answer. At the same time, the group of teenagers started pulling up Nolan's location through Snapchat, since they all followed each other there. Christine opened a separate app, Life 360, tracking his phone independently. The two apps didn't agree. Nolan's phone showed up in one location. His car showed up somewhere else entirely. That mismatch is still one of the strangest details in this entire case. A phone in one place, a car in another, two pieces of technology telling two different stories before a single human being had said a word. While that was unfolding, Christine and her husband Elmore turned to actually reporting Nolan missing, and that's where the night got harder. The sheriff's department pointed them toward the city of Ocean Springs. Ocean Springs pointed them toward the Department of Marine Resources. Marine Resources took her information and sent her back to Ocean Springs Police. Picture that. A mother, past midnight, on the worst night of her life, being handed from one office to another, trying to figure out who was even responsible for finding her son. Eventually, Jackson County stepped in and took the case over. But by then, real time had already slipped away. Hours spent not searching, not investigating, just trying to identify who had jurisdiction. One of Nolan's friends had already called the Coast Guard that night, close to 11 p.m. But the Jackson County Sheriff's Office didn't formally request Coast Guard assistance until around noon the next day. More than 12 hours later. That gap doesn't prove anything on its own. Overnight search operations in remote areas often move slower than anyone would like, for reasons that have nothing to do with wrongdoing. But it's still 12 hours. 12 hours on a case where every hour mattered. Meanwhile, Toshima had gone to retrieve the phone herself, at Christine's request, rather than leave it with the boys any longer. It took a while even for that handoff to happen. First to get the phone, then separately to arrange picking up Nolan's car from the house where the boys had stayed the night before. By the time the sun came up on July 5th, Nolan Wells had been missing for hours, and his family still didn't have him back, didn't have straight answers, and didn't yet know they were about to spend the next several days fighting for both. Elmore Wansley has one rule he says he drilled into his son for years. If you leave with the group, you come back with the group. No exceptions. He said it plainly, more than once. If he'd been there, if Nolan had told him he wanted to stay behind, Elmore says he would have made him get back on that boat. And if Nolan pushed back, he'd have handed him a phone right there and had his own parents tell him the same thing. He would never have left someone else's child on an island he could only leave by water. So when the explanation came back that Nolan chose to stay, that he wanted to talk to a girl, that he'd catch a ride with someone else later, something in Elmore turned off immediately. Not because it sounded impossible, because it didn't sound like his son. Christine's answer was just as direct. Asked if she believes Nolan chose to stay behind, she said no. She doesn't believe he made that decision on his own. Elmore has talked about who Nolan was in a way that goes beyond a father defending his kid on instinct. He described him as widely respected, the kind of person other teenagers followed without him needing to say much. A silent leader, on the football field and off it. He remembered telling Nolan more than once not to split off from his friends chasing after a girl. "There are girls everywhere," he'd say. "She's not the only one." He used to tell him, "One day you're going to thank me for nagging you like this." That's the frame Elmore keeps coming back to. 3 friends leave the island. 1 stays. In his mind, the other three should have made sure that one person had what he needed: his phone, his bag, a way home, even if it meant an argument in the moment. A little friction, then everyone gets back to the mainland, and either they're still annoyed with each other, or they're not. Either way, you don't leave somebody behind on an island without their phone. Nolan had real stakes riding on that week. A tryout waiting for him that Monday, a season already asking a lot of him. Elmore doesn't believe his son threw all of that away on a whim, for a girl he'd met that same afternoon. There's a detail that complicates the story even further. Christine says that in the very first conversation she had about what happened, she was told two things at once: that Nolan stayed behind for a girl named Katie, and that Katie herself was also missing, and that nobody in the group actually knew who she was. Sit with that. The entire explanation for why Nolan didn't come home depended on a specific person, and in the first version of events Christine ever heard, that same person was described as unaccounted for and a stranger to everyone there. Christine has also had to answer something uglier running alongside the grief. Nolan's friend group that day was mostly white, and some of the public reaction turned into questions about why he was even in that group. Her response has been direct. She and her husband never taught their children to choose friends by skin color. Nolan's heart, she said, was big enough for anybody, and the outpouring from his own friends since his death proves how he was raised, not the opposite. If someone has a problem with that, she said, it's their problem, not hers. That support hasn't come only from his friends. Coaches who worked with him for years have said the same things his parents do, independently, without being asked to. His wide receivers coach remembered Nolan's official recruiting visit and how he made sure his younger brother got to try on the team uniform right alongside him. His head coach called him a genuine person, the kind who wants to see the good in everyone. He remembered a game where Nolan barely played and still celebrated the win like it was his own. None of that proves what happened on Horn Island. But it's the reason a family, a coaching staff, and a friend group who never coordinated their answers all describe the same person. And it's why, when the story came back that Nolan simply chose to stay behind, his own father says something turned off in him, because the boy in that story wasn't the boy he raised. There's a contradiction sitting at the center of everything, and it starts with one conversation. Nolan's friends say he told them he wanted to stay behind and talk to the girl. The girl says Nolan told her he was heading back to the boat. Two people. One conversation. Opposite versions. Ben Crump put it plainly at a press conference. They're not saying the same thing. One of them is telling the truth, and one of them isn't. For weeks, nobody on the boat side of that story had a name attached to it. Then that changed. A friend of Nolan's named Tracken Shepard came forward, on the record, under his own name, and gave a very different account than the one that had been circulating. Shepard says there was no altercation involving Nolan. He says the viral video everyone had been talking about, the one with a voice supposedly shouting about a phone, isn't even Nolan's voice. It's his own. He says he was the one yelling that day, during a completely separate incident with someone else entirely, and that Nolan wasn't anywhere near it. That's a direct contradiction of what Crump had said publicly. Crump, at an earlier press conference, said multiple people identified that voice as Nolan's. Asked about it again more recently, his answer shifted. That's what a witness told us, he said. Since then, another witness has come forward saying it wasn't him. Audio experts are apparently trying to sort it out now. As of the most recent update, nobody's confirmed either way. Shepard also addressed the phone directly. His explanation is almost mundane compared to everything swirling around it. He says leaving a phone behind isn't unusual at all when a group goes out on the water. Everyone's already together, he said, so who exactly are you texting? And salt water doesn't mix well with a phone in your pocket. He says Nolan put his on the boat's dash that day, the same as probably 15 other phones belonging to everyone else there. His uncle, who was driving one of the boats, has apparently backed up that account. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it's a real competing explanation, not just a denial. If it's true, the missing phone isn't necessarily evidence of anything sinister. It's just what happens when a group of teenagers spends a day on the water and nobody wants to ruin their phone. But it doesn't explain why Christine says the phone came back essentially empty. No saved photos, no saved videos. Nothing at all from an entire day at the beach, checked before Snapchat's own 24-hour window had even closed. A phone sitting untouched on a boat dash doesn't explain missing content. Those are two separate questions, and right now, neither one has a confirmed answer. Then there's the photo. A picture started circulating that appeared to show Nolan at a pool party in the early hours of July 5th, hours after he'd supposedly stayed behind on the island. If real, it would mean he'd somehow made it back to the mainland alive. Crump reposted it publicly, asking people to help identify where and when it was taken. Shepard says that photo isn't from that night at all. He says it's from a completely different party, weeks earlier, in a different town. Rolling Stone later reported the same thing, citing metadata from the original photographer that placed it in late June, not July 5th. When Crump was asked about it afterward, he pushed back on the idea that he'd vouched for it. Reposting isn't the same as authenticating, he said. His team shares things specifically to generate tips, not to confirm facts. That's a fair distinction to draw. But it's also true that once something gets shared by an attorney representing the family, a lot of people treat it as more credible than a random post from an anonymous account, whether that's fair or not. Shepard has pushed back on more than just the evidence. He's rejected the idea that race played any role in what happened, pointing out that his friend group has always been mixed and that this wasn't unusual for any of them. He said the narrative being built around it isn't the reality he lived. And he said something else, quieter than the rest, that's easy to miss inside all the noise around this case. Since Nolan's death, he and his friends have received death threats. People online have decided who's guilty without ever meeting any of them. Shepard has asked, more than once, for people to let the investigation actually happen instead of convicting his entire friend group in public first. He said he lost his best friend too, that nobody in their group wanted to see Nolan hurt, let alone dead. That if Crump's own investigation finds something real, let it find it, but let it be real first. So where does that leave things? A contradiction between the girl and the friends that's never been resolved. A named witness now directly disputing the phone video and the phone story both. A photo that looked like a lead and turned out to be from a different night entirely. And two groups of people, on opposite sides of this story, both saying the same thing in different words. Somebody isn't telling the truth. None of it tells us what actually happened to Nolan. What it tells us is that almost nothing in this case has held up cleanly once someone else came forward to challenge it. And the people challenging it aren't strangers online. They're the same friends who were standing right there. One detail makes this harder to explain away, and it starts with how the phone came back to Christine at all. She didn't get it from investigators. She got it because a friend went and found it herself. Using the Life 360 app, Christine could see the phone's location didn't match where Nolan's car was sitting. That gap is what set everything else in motion. She called a family friend, Toshima, and asked her to physically track the device down rather than wait on the boys to hand it over on their own. It took time. First to retrieve the phone, then separately to arrange getting Nolan's car back from the house, where the group had stayed the night before the trip. By the time it reached Christine's hands, hours had already passed since anyone first realized Nolan was missing. When she finally opened it, she says she found almost nothing. No saved photos from the day, no saved videos. She checked his second Snapchat account too, also empty. She's described Nolan as someone constantly documenting his life, sending her selfies just to check in, a peace sign, a smile. A phone like that coming back completely blank from an entire day at the beach struck her immediately as wrong. Ben Crump has put the same doubt in blunter terms. What teenager leaves their phone behind if he's planning to stay on the island, he's asked. What teenager doesn't take it with him? He said flatly that none of it adds up. Snapchat content typically disappears on its own after 24 hours if nobody saves it. Christine says she and her sister started searching the phone before that window had even closed. If there had been anything there to begin with, it should still have been recoverable. It wasn't. That's led the family to a conclusion they've stated plainly. They believe messages, both on Snapchat and in standard texts, were deleted from that phone before it ever reached them. It's worth being honest about what deletion actually means here, because it's more complicated than it sounds. One legal analyst who's worked cases involving digital evidence has said deleting something rarely erases it completely. It usually just hides it at different levels within the device, in ways a proper forensic examination can often still recover. There's also a separate legal wrinkle. Text messages typically pass through a carrier's network on their way to being delivered, which means a copy may exist somewhere beyond just the phone itself. Even a successfully deleted message on the device isn't necessarily gone from every possible record. That's part of why the chain of custody question matters so much here. The phone sat in the friend's possession for a number of hours before Christine ever saw it. Legal analysts examining this case have said that gap alone, phone in someone else's hands, content missing once it finally reached the family, could support an argument of evidence tampering in court, regardless of whether the specific content turns out to matter. There's a legal tool that exists for exactly this kind of situation. An exigent circumstances warrant lets investigators move fast, compelling a phone carrier or a platform like Snapchat to preserve and hand over data quickly, without waiting on the normal timeline, specifically because a missing person's device might hold something critical before it disappears for good. Multiple legal analysts examining this case have publicly asked why that tool doesn't appear to have been used here in the first several days. The phone wasn't seized early. No emergency preservation request has been confirmed. It was the family, not investigators, who ended up going through the device first. A spokesperson for Snapchat's parent company told CBS News the company stands ready to work with law enforcement, phrasing that suggests they may not have been formally engaged at that point, or that if they had been, nobody had confirmed it. There's a smaller detail connected to all this that's easy to overlook, but it's the kind of thing that's actually simple to verify. A young woman who'd been on the island that day reached out to Christine after she posted publicly asking for information. She had her own photos from July 4th, and in them, Nolan is wearing blue shorts. The official report describes him wearing black. Those aren't colors you mix up looking at a photograph. It's a small thing on its own, but it's a documented image contradicting an official record on a fact that shouldn't be hard to get right. The most significant development on the phone came recently, when Christine and Elmore sat down directly with the Jackson County District Attorney's Office. Both sides agreed to something unusual: a joint simultaneous inspection of the device, the family's own experts, and the state's team examining it together, at the same time, so nobody sees a separate version of what's actually on it. One attorney who spoke about the arrangement called it highly unusual for a victim's family to participate directly alongside law enforcement in extracting data from a phone. His read was straightforward. It likely wouldn't have happened without the public pressure already surrounding this case, and it reflects real distrust between the family and investigators. That distrust didn't come from nowhere. It came from a phone that took too long to reach them, arrived without content it should have had, and left more questions behind than it answered. Everything up to this point has come from memory. Someone's account of a conversation, someone's recollection of a phone, someone's version of who said what. Then something different showed up: GPS data, a time-stamped mechanical record of exactly where a boat went that day, independent of what anyone chose to say about it afterward. CBS News obtained that data from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. According to the record, the boat left its dock at 9:56 that morning and arrived at Horn Island at 11:14. Nothing unusual there. It matches everything already known about how the day began. The boat left Horn Island at 4:31 that afternoon, heading back to its original dock. That timestamp lines up closely with what a local judge, whose own son was on that boat, had already said publicly, that the group left around 4:30 because of a failing bilge pump. The GPS data gives that account something it didn't have before: independent confirmation, at least of the timing. It's worth being careful about how far that confirmation actually goes. The GPS only verifies when the boat moved. It doesn't verify why. It doesn't confirm the bilge pump story, and it says nothing about what was said between Nolan and the friends who left without him. One matching data point isn't the same as the whole story checking out. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. The boat didn't stay parked at the dock for the night after that 4:31 return. According to the data, it went out again. At 5:52 that evening, it traveled into Fort Bayou. It returned to the dock at 6:06, a round trip of about 14 minutes. Then, at 7:19, it moved a third time to the Fort Bayou boat launch, before what appears to be an overland tow back to the owner's residence. Nobody in any account given publicly so far has mentioned that second trip, not the judge's statement. Not Elmore's account of retrieving the car and the keys, not Shepard's interview. It's a documented, time-stamped movement of that boat with no public explanation attached to it at all. There are entirely innocent possibilities. Boats need fuel. Equipment gets left behind and has to be retrieved. If the bilge pump problem was real, a short trip might have been part of sorting out repairs before the boat was trailered home for the night. Fort Bayou is a real, ordinary waterway in the area, not some remote or suspicious destination on its own. But an innocent explanation isn't the same as a confirmed one. In a case already built on a missing phone, deleted messages, and a 13-hour gap before a formal search began, one more unexplained gap is exactly the kind of thing that deserves a direct answer from whoever was actually on that boat during those trips. There's one more detail buried in the same report. It identifies the boat's owner, his mother, and one other individual who was reportedly with Nolan that day as people who have cooperated with the investigation. That's the first time an adult's connection to this case has shown up in an official document rather than as a second-hand claim. It doesn't confirm everything Elmore has said publicly about an adult being present on the boat, but it does move the question of adult involvement from speculation into the actual record. A crime scene investigator who reviewed the dispatch audio and the GPS data more recently raised the same question a lot of people have been asking from the beginning. If Nolan was in real distress in the water, on a holiday weekend, near a stretch of coastline with hundreds of people around, how does nobody notice? The timeline answers where the boat went. It still hasn't answered how Nolan died. Right now, nobody has an official answer for how Nolan Wells died. The state medical examiner performed an autopsy in early July. The cause and manner of death still haven't been released publicly. Toxicology results, officials have said, could take weeks. The independent autopsy the family commissioned, led by a Washington, D.C. medical examiner with no ties to Mississippi, was expected to come back quickly. As of the most recent reporting, those results are still pending too. What has moved is the legal process around the case. Christine and Elmore sat down directly with the Jackson County District Attorney's Office and came away with something concrete. The DA told them that once the Sheriff's Department finishes its investigation, the case will go to a grand jury. That's not a guarantee of charges. It's not even confirmation this is being treated as a criminal case at this stage. The DA has said as much herself, that nobody wants to rush to judgment. But it's a real step, one that didn't exist a few weeks ago. Alongside the official investigation, the family has built one of their own. A legal team, working with former law enforcement and federal agents, has reportedly been fielding somewhere between 50 and 100 calls a day, from people who were on Horn Island themselves or who know someone who was. Some of those callers, according to the family's attorney, haven't been willing to talk to local law enforcement directly. The goal, he said, isn't to keep that information for themselves, but to get those witnesses talking to investigators too. This case has drawn support far beyond the family and their attorney. Colin Kaepernick helped fund the cost of the independent autopsy. Filmmaker Tyler Perry is covering funeral expenses. Reverend Al Sharpton has agreed to officiate the service. Representative Benny Thompson has called for a transparent, timely investigation. None of that changes what actually happened to Nolan, but it says something about how far this story has traveled from a single missing persons report on a holiday weekend. Nolan's funeral has been arranged at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, with Reverend Al Sharpton set to officiate. That location wasn't the original plan. The Mississippi Coast Coliseum had initially agreed to host the service, before the family decided against it, and the venue moved to the church instead. Christine has said plainly what she wants that day to feel like: a celebration, not a funeral spent sitting around grieving. Nolan, she said, wouldn't have wanted that. So here's where things actually sit. A contradiction between two accounts of one conversation, never resolved. A named witness directly disputing the phone video and the phone story both. A photo that turned out to be from a different night. A phone that came back empty, now set for a joint inspection nobody fully trusts yet. A boat that moved 3 times on a night when nobody's explained why. 2 autopsies, both still pending. A grand jury, waiting for an investigation that isn't finished. Nolan Wells was 18, a wide receiver with a tryout waiting for him that never came. A young man other people naturally followed. His parents aren't asking anyone to accept a theory. They're not naming a suspect. What they've said, consistently, across every interview since the day they got that call at 11:07 at night, is one thing. The story they were given doesn't match the son they raised. And until someone can explain that gap in a way that actually holds together, they're not going to stop asking. There's no clean ending to give you here. No verdict, no resolution, nothing tied up the way these stories sometimes are. What there is a family who hasn't stopped asking questions since the night they got that call. A community showing up at a funeral to celebrate a life instead of just mourning it. And a young man that everyone who actually knew him describes the exact same way, without ever comparing notes. If you knew Nolan, if you were there that day, or if you just have thoughts on everything laid out here, the comments are open. This case is still moving, and we'll be back with whatever comes next, once it's actually confirmed. Thank you for sitting with this one. Take care of each other out there.